Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Amateur Radio Technician class session number 9. In our previous session, we had our usual Q&A, followed by a look at our curriculum progress. Also, again, re-mentioning the practice exams. Then we went into the technical topics, antenna polarization, radio wave polarization. We discussed what is sporadic E, also auroral backscatter, meteor scatter. We also went into what is tropospheric ducting. We discussed the effects of weather on propagation. We also talked about ionospheric propagation. Then we delved into the 11-year sunspot cycle. And we ended the technical topics with HF signal propagation fading. Then we did our usual question pool review. So our agenda for this evening, we have a little Q&A to deal with. We'll see where we are with respect to our curriculum. Again, we'll mention about the practice exams, the links to them. Then we get into the technical topics of antennas. We discuss resonance. Then we go specifically into half-wave dipoles, quarter-wave verticals. We do a couple of calculations on antenna lengths. Then we go into other types of antennas, such as beam antennas, what the isotropic radiator is. We also talk about antenna gain, Yagi antennas. Then we discuss rubber duck antennas. We talk a bit about what is known as the shielding effect. Then back again at antennas, the 5/8 wave vertical. Then Feedlines, then we'll do our usual question pool review and then set the date for the next session. Okay. All right. So we are looking now at the Q&A. And the question that we had from the last session is, so the signal is traveling almost at the speed of light. And the answer is yes, radio waves do travel at the speed of light, at least in free space or vacuum. However, when it's traveling in air, such as on the Earth, we need to be aware that that speed is just a little bit less than the speed of light. So approximately the speed of light, yes. And I do apologize. I know we would have gotten quite a lot of questions being sent in via email. Some of them are direct one-on-one questions, but we got a bit of an avalanche of questions over the last several days, and we have not been able to deal with all of them. So again, I do apologize to the students. We will attempt to get to all of the questions in due course. Okay, so in terms of our curriculum, these are the topics, and this is where we are. We are commencing antennas and feed lines today, and we will just about cover most of it, but not quite. So almost all of this will be dealt with this evening. All right, in terms of the practice exams, just a reminder to all participants, please consider taking these practice tests. It's never too early to do so. Just a reminder of the course material that we're using. We're using the No Nonsense Technician Class License Study Guide, the version that is for between 2022 and 2026. Make sure that's the version, that's the one we have circulated. So make sure that's the one that you're looking at. And we now come to the topic of antennas. So we have talked about antennas before, but on your screen is a bit of a definition as to what an antenna is. And we're not going to go into everything. This is just for your own leisurely reading and information. But what we need to take away from this is that an antenna is what we use to transmit and receive radio signals. And on the right-hand side here are some examples of antennas on the right here. And we will get a bit more into the different types of antennas, what they're called, the properties, when they might be used. But we just need to know that antennas are important to amateur radio, and we'll get into them in a bit. One of the properties of antennas is the concept of resonance. And there's a little catchphrase that we'll be using that you'll be hearing us repeating from time to time, which is hams are matchmakers. So it will become a lot clearer as to what that means later on in the course. Hams are matchmakers. We're always matching things. As to what we are matching, well, we'll come to that. One of them, as you probably would have discovered when we had talked about the concept of frequency and the relationship to wavelength, that is one of the things that we are matching. So if we are trying to transmit or receive on a particular frequency, we need an antenna of that wavelength. So that's one of the things that we match. If we are trying to transmit on the 2-meter band, well, we need an antenna that is at least electrically equivalent to 2 meters or so. If we are transmitting on the 70 centimeter band, we need an antenna that is about 70 centimeters or so, based on the wavelength of that frequency that we are looking to either transmit or receive. The closer they're matched, the better the transmission, the better the reception. We'll have maximum signal transfer, right? So the concept of resonance refers to where the electrical properties of the antenna are well matched to the radio's output and transmission line. And we'll come to a bit more as to transmission lines, what that is, and so on, right? So the resonant frequency of an antenna, and each antenna will have a resonant frequency, at least one resonant frequency, and is directly related to its physical and electrical length. And we'll come a bit more as to what that means. But we need to know that hams are matchmakers. We are looking to match our frequency by making sure the antenna is at the correct length for that frequency. And in doing so, we are attempting to achieve generally what is known as resonance. Our antenna needs to be resonant. Our circuit that is transmitting or receiving also needs to be resonant, and therefore why we are saying that hams need to be matchmakers. We are matching, in this case for antennas, frequency to wavelength. All right, so let's get now into a specific type of antenna. It's called the dipole antenna. And on your right-hand side, we have pictorially what a dipole antenna might look like. So we have a feed line, right? So this feed line actually goes to our transmitter or receiver. So we have a feed line connecting our radio to the antenna itself. And this is the antenna here. These two sticks on this side, on the left and the right of the antenna, are really to support the antenna. The antenna wouldn't just float in air or float in space. It will require some sort of mount. And in this case here, that's what these gray bars represent. It's holding up the antenna. But the antenna itself is this. And notice once we have the feed line going to the antenna starts here, it goes out to the right and it goes out to the left. So this antenna that is constructed like this, when the feed line goes to the middle or the center point, and then it goes the antenna itself, and this is likely to be wire. This arrangement is called a dipole antenna. And this is a typical antenna. It's one of the most basic forms of antenna in amateur radio. And it is relatively easy to make or construct. And you could probably tell that by just looking at that. You'll say, but wait a minute, you have the feed line and you just have one piece of wire going one direction and another piece of wire going the other direction. That's it. Pretty much, you could mount it like this, which is horizontally to the earth. You can mount it vertically. You can mount it at an angle. We have this mounted horizontally. But the important thing, as we'll come to see in a little while when we construct the antenna, is the length of this wire. It's not just random, right? We have to choose the length for what we talked about earlier, which is resonance. We're trying to get our antenna to be resonant on the particular frequency that we are transmitting or receiving on. And that's important as hams to know what that resonant frequency is and therefore what the length of the antennas would be. Okay, so let's look at something that's pretty interesting here now. So we talked about the dipole antenna, and the dipole antenna is represented on this graph here also. So you will see the feed line coming here, and then we have the antenna wire going in one direction and the other direction. So it's mounted according to this in a sort of vertical way instead of horizontally that we saw earlier. But it's the same dipole antenna, dipole 1, 2. So this antenna, what we're trying to illustrate with this diagram is that it radiates a signal, an electromagnetic wave or a radio frequency wave, and it emits it in a particular way. There's a pattern to which it does this, right? So if this is our antenna and it's vertically mounted, these lobes that you see off to the right, this is not part of the antenna. This is just a graph showing the signal strength or where the signal is actually going, how it looks. So notice it's not a circle or it's not a sphere. It's looking like a figure 8, right? Off to this side, you're seeing a lot of signal going this way, and off to the other side on the left, you're seeing similar. But above, below, you're not seeing much. So the right-hand side and the left-hand side of this dipole antenna that you're seeing that's vertically mounted, we consider this to be broadside. So you'll hear us a little bit talking about broadside to the antenna. So this is broadside to the antenna, all right? So that's where for this type of antenna, it shines, it transmits its signal maximally broadside to the antenna. And this here is looking at the antenna as it's mounted vertically. So we are almost looking at it head on, right? So when we look at it this way, this is the pattern of the transmission or the shape of the wave that is coming out of the antenna itself. So again, it's like a figure 8, or some people call it an hourglass shape, and this represents the maximum radiation pattern of this particular antenna, known as the dipole. So again, at its broadside, which is this, and on this end, it has maximum transmission, and then towards the ends or the poles, which is all here, it has very little or minimum signal going out these ends. So these antennas do have a pattern when they transmit and also receive. So let's go again. All right, so we're delving a little deeper. We are honing in a little more. We talked about the dipole antenna. So let's specifically now talk about the half-wave dipole. Yeah. So again, this may look familiar to the previous diagrams. We have zoomed in a little bit. So you will see here that we have our what is called the feed line. You'll see we represent Earth here. And if our feed line goes up to the antenna, so the antenna itself starts here, goes to the right and goes to the left, it's really 2 wires. It could be metal rods as well, but it's number for antennas, we're talking about metals. So metal wire off to the left and off to the right. And we are trying to transmit on this antenna. This is our feed line that goes to our radio. We're trying to get our radio signal through this feed line to the antenna. And the antenna, what we are trying to achieve is for this antenna to radiate our signal, our wireless signal, or radio frequency. That's what we're trying to do. And we need to be mindful that for maximum transmission, for maximum signal transfer, for maximum efficiency, this antenna needs to be of a certain length. What length that is? Well, it's the wavelength, and it also needs to be related to the frequency. So we need to cut or construct or make or have this antenna for that purpose, for the particular frequency band or the frequency itself that we are looking to transmit on. So that's where, again, the concept of resonance comes in. Now, we call this a half-wave dipole, as we have been calling for the last couple of slides. But notice something about the half-wave dipole. When we say half-wave, we are saying really half wavelength. So the frequency that we are transmitting on or receiving on has a wavelength. So we're talking about half of that. So we are trying to construct an antenna that is half of the entire wavelength of the frequency that we want to use. But to do that, to make the antenna half wavelength, and we said that a dipole has 2 legs. It goes this way and then it goes that way. How do we measure what each leg needs to be? So if the total length from end to end needs to be about half wave or half wavelength, and it's 2 equal lengths, 1 to each side, what's the length of each side? And I'm hearing everyone shouting, well, if it's half wave total and it's 2 equal pieces, 1 on the left, 1 on the right, each length needs to be quarter wavelength. You'd be quite right. So the total from this end to this end is half wavelength. But we need to split that into 2. And a half of a half is a quarter. So we end up with a quarter wavelength wire on one side, a quarter wavelength wire on the other side. So each leg is a quarter wavelength, even though we call the antenna a half-wave dipole. The reason it's a half-wave dipole is because the total length of this antenna is half-wave. But when you're constructing it, you cannot make this length half wave and this other length half wave. Then you'll have a full wave antenna. What you're trying to get is to half wave, short, resonant, it works. And again, half wave dipole antenna is what we have drawn here. On the left, on the diagram, we have a simpler representation. You have the feed line here. And we are also showing that from end to end, it is half wave. But as the diagram above shows, from the center point, or what we call the feed point of the antenna, to one end, it's quarter wave. And from the feed point to the other end, it's quarter waves. So quarter wavelength, or quarter plus quarter, is a half. So hopefully that is making sense to us. And there's an exam-related question to what we have all just discussed. And it's in yellow. By now, most of the participants in the class would recognize that once we usually put bullet points in yellow, for the most part, it tends to be an exam question that we will meet up in our exam. So let's see, what is that point that we need to learn for the exam? It's pretty much a summary of what we just said. It says a horizontally polarized antenna describes a simple dipole oriented parallel to the Earth's surface. So let's dissect this a little bit. Horizontally polarized antennas. Remember, probably previous class, we said when we talk about polarization, we're talking about the E field or the electric field of a radio frequency wave. So when we talk polarization, that's the actual electric field is in the direction of the wire. So notice how the wire is horizontal. It's not vertical. The antenna itself is horizontal, and it's horizontal, which is parallel to the Earth's surface. So this dotted line here is kind of meant to represent the Earth. And notice that the antenna itself, which is this, is horizontal and parallel to Earth. So that's what it says here. Horizontally polarized antenna describes a simple dipole oriented parallel. So it's parallel to the Earth's surface. That's all that means here. And it's an exam question, so you need to learn it. Hopefully we have understood what this means by having gone through the previous couple of slides. All right, so let's emphasize things a little bit and bring it together and also deal with two more exam questions. So you would have seen both diagrams before. It's just we might have turned one of them a little bit on its side, right? So the one on the right-hand side, you have the feed line going to the antenna center point, and then the two legs of the antenna. This is the antenna itself. We have our lobe or radiation pattern. That's the signal going out of the antenna when we transmit. To show you where the maximum signal transfer occurs. We also have the same dipole oriented in this way as well. It's vertically oriented. And we're saying that when this is like this, we're saying this is broadside. So this antenna, when we mount it vertically in the air, is going to broadside to the antenna, is going to have the maximum radiation or the maximum signal. And those are the exam questions. So let's deal with them. The direction in which a half-wave dipole antenna radiates the strongest signal is broadside to the antenna. So let's dissect that a little bit. So to say the direction in which a half-wave dipole, so this is a half-wave dipole, right? So hopefully we are convinced of that. You have a feed line coming up to it. So we always try to stick a feed line in to show where we are feeding the antenna. But technically it's not the antenna. At least most of the times the feed line is not part of the antenna. So in this case it's not. This is the antenna here. And we're saying that this radiates the strongest signal. So if we were to look at this here, we see the strongest signal is in this direction. There's almost no signal all here, right? No signal all here. It is in this direction as well as this direction. And this is considered broadside. And this is what we mean by putting broadside here. This antenna radiates maximum in this direction and this direction all around. This is broadside to the antenna. Remember, this is a wire, so broadside is actually all around, right? So this is the exam question that you need to learn. There's something else that we need to know about antennas generally, but certainly for a dipole antenna. So remember we said that when we're using an antenna, hams are matchmakers. We are trying to make our antenna match the frequency we are transmitting on, because there are problems if we use an antenna that is not matched to the frequency, and we'll see later on. We'll come to several concepts that illustrates that. Tonight, actually, we will touch on more on a little bit. So we need to know for the exam that if this is the antenna here, and we have constructed our wire antenna being familiar with wavelength and frequency, the relationship between the two, and we have constructed this antenna. And we need to know that if we shorten the antenna, we take a little nippers and clip it off at both ends a little bit. what we are actually doing is increasing the resonant frequency of the dipole antenna. So remember we talked about the relationship between frequency and wavelength, or frequency and length of antenna. It's an inverse relationship. The higher frequency, the shorter the wavelength, and vice versa. So if it is that we somehow shorten this antenna, what are we doing with the resonant frequency? Are we increasing, or are we decreasing? Right. So the exam question here is, what is that about? It says shortening increases the resonant frequency of the dipole antenna. So again, inverse relationship. We shorten the antenna, we clip off a little piece here on both ends, and we have increased the resonant frequency, because we know and we have learned that frequency and wavelength are inversely proportional. It's a relationship between the two. You shorten one, you increase the other one. All right, so that's an exam question. So let's make it real by doing a calculation here again. In a way, it's about constructing an antenna. And this is an exam question that you'll get, and we have worked it out. Hopefully we have included most, if not all, of the steps that's needed to understand this question, right? So let's deal with the question. All right. So what is the approximate length in inches of a half wavelength 6-meter dipole antenna? So let's dissect this question a little bit. When you look at this question, you're probably saying, wait a minute. They're asking us, they want to know the length in inches, but they're telling us it's a half wave 6-meter dipole. So, you know, they're mixing imperial units with SI or metric units, yes? So that's what you get, right? Again, remember, we're doing American exams, and in the US, they still use quite a lot of imperial units, right? But science and the scientific community use SI units or the metric system. So you'll find a little bit of a combination, and it's all good. You know, we will learn a bit about both. So hopefully we'll be quite comfortable dealing and switching between the two. So let's get to dissecting the question. Today, what are they asking us? What is the approximate length? So we know the answer will be some length, but they're saying in inches. So therefore, we know we are aiming to get an answer that says something inches. Yeah? Of what though? Of a half wave or a half wavelength antenna. That's what we're talking about. But what type of antenna? They're telling us it's a 6-meter dipole antenna. So let's go back to our trusty little diagram here that shows how a dipole is constructed. We have our feed line, our cable that goes to our radio, and it meets the antenna here. This is the center point that we are, or the feed point of the antenna. And then now we know this is a half wave dipole. And we want to know what's the approximate length of this antenna in totality. They didn't ask us for one legger. They ask us, what's the length of this antenna? So we are talking about the whole antenna from this end to this end. But we know it's a half wavelength antenna. But a half wavelength on what frequency? For us to know the length or the wavelength, we need to know the frequency. Did they tell us? Well, they told us the band. They told us it's a 6-meter band, or it's a 6-meter dipole antenna. So we could work that out a bit. So let's do the calculation here. So we're saying that half wavelength, which is what the antenna is, but it's cut for 6 meters, so it's a 6-meter dipole. Half wavelength of, so a full wavelength of a 6-meter band antenna would be 6 meters, right? Because the frequency matches, the resonance of that frequency matches the band, right? So if it's a 6-meter antenna, that's a full wavelength. What is a half wavelength? So you probably already occurred to you and say, well, half of 6, and you'll be quite correct. Half of 6 will be 3. So a half wavelength antenna, so if a full wavelength is 6 meters, half wavelength will be 3 meters. So we have the length there. But guess what? We cannot just simply give that as an answer. It will be, in a way, correct from the point of view of the length of it, but it would not be correct because they did not ask us what's the length in meters. What did they ask us? They asked us the approximate length in inches. So this question is about converting meters to inches as well. So 1 meter is approximately 39.4 inches. So learn that, note it. You need to know that for the calculation. And if we have to convert meters to inches, all we simply do is multiply by 39.4. So how many ever meters we have, we multiply by 39.4. And this is what we will do in our next step. How many meters is the half wavelength antenna? We worked that out already. We said it's 3 meters. From here to here is 3 meters, but we need that answer in inches. So we are multiplying the 3, which is 3 meters, which is the length we're looking for, by the number of inches per meter, and it's 39.4 inches per meter. So 3 multiplied by 39.4 is 118.2 inches. Is that the answer? Well, kinda. It's not the answer that we are looking for yet. And you're probably saying to yourself, but wait a minute, Robbie just said that we just need to work out what half wavelength is, and it's going to be in inches, and that's it. Well, folks, this is amateur radio, and there are several things, several factors that we need to take into account. And we need to be aware, even though we might think we'll construct an antenna by just using the frequency and coming up with the length just so, we need to be aware that practically, when you're actually constructing an antenna like this, a dipole antenna, you actually have to cut it shorter, all right? And that approximate shorter is 5% shorter. So not only is it good enough to convert it to inches, we have to now subtract from it or take away 5%. So we're going to be left with 95% of the length. So 118.2 is what we got when we multiplied 3 by 39.4. But that is not the answer. You will not see that, and that is not the correct answer at all for the question. We have to now subtract or take away 5%. So if we take away 5%, 5%, we have a little working on the right-hand side for those who may be interested or would like to see it. 5% is a 5 over 100, which is 0.05. But we want to take 5% away, right? So we take 5% away from 1. So 0.05, if we take that away from 1, we are left with 0.95, or that is 95%. So we need 95%. That's what we need to calculate. 95% is taking away 5%, or saying 5% shorter. So because we want 95% of the length, we multiply 0.95 multiplied by what we got earlier, 118.2. And we arrive now approximately at what the correct answer for the question is. And again, this is a question in the exam. The correct answer is 112 inches. So hopefully we have understood how we have turned this question into this answer. All right, let's go again. We are now going to talk about another type of antenna called the quarter wave vertical antenna, and some people will also refer it as a ground plane. So you'll hear hams and radio operators saying quarter wave ground plane, right? We'll be calling it a quarter wave vertical antenna, and we're just mentioning that it's also called a ground plane. And what antenna that is? Well, if we were to look on the right-hand side here, you'll see a blue line. That's a metal rod. And this length here of this metal rod will be quarter wavelength. Again, quarter wavelength of what? Well, of the frequency that you intend to use the antenna on. So if it's HF or VHF or UHF or some other frequency band or range, you need to know what that frequency is to calculate the antenna. But whatever it is, it's going to be quarter wavelength. That's the length of the antenna. But that's not all that the antenna is constructed of. We have the bottom part of the antenna, which could be what we call radials, right? It could be metal wires, it could be metal rods. So these are radials. But what we're interested in for our discussion here is this quarter wavelength antenna is this rod here that you see in blue. All right, so quarter wave vertical antenna. And it's also a very efficient antenna. And it also tends to be compact. Why are we saying it's compact? Because it's quarter wavelength. It's not a full wavelength. It's not 5/8 wavelength. It's not half wavelength. It's a quarter wavelength. So that's what we mean by when we say it's relatively compact. So, you know, size could be an issue, right? Maybe if you're having a base station antenna, you have limited space that you might want to mount it. So maybe what you want is a quarter wavelength antenna, right? So let's see what that actually might look like. All right. So to make it real, we are showing a picture of what a quarter wavelength vertical antenna might look like, or quarter wave ground plane. So again, there's this rod that we're seeing here. That's quarter wavelength. But we also have the counterpoise or the ground plane, and that could be either wires or it could be radials made out of wires and so on, right? So this length from top to bottom of the antenna is quarter wavelength. And on the right-hand side here, again, we have reproduced this to show this is the length, or what we call the element length. And that length is quarter wavelength. So nice. So let's do a calculation on it as well to make it real and take care of an exam question while at it. And once we have completed this question, I think we could probably go into a 2-minute break and see if we can cover the rest of the material tonight. So let's deal with the question pool question and a worked example as well. So remember, we are talking about a quarter wave antenna. Let's bear that in mind here, right? So here goes. What's the question? What is the approximate length in inches of a quarter wavelength vertical antenna for 146 megahertz? So let's dissect this question a little bit. So they're asking us, what are they asking us for? They're asking us for what is the approximate length. So we know the answer we're going to come up with is some length. But they've also specified that they want that length in inches. They didn't ask us for millimeters or centimeters or meters, or they said in inches. So we know we need to work out in inches. Now, if you're thinking, but wait a minute, this question is kind of similar to the previous question we dealt with, you'll be quite correct. It's a very similar type of question, right? What's different is the type of antenna and the frequency band of the antenna, or the wavelength, all right? So what type of antenna we're asking about for our quarter wavelength vertical, and that's what we just dealt with. And on the right-hand side, we've reproduced that antenna. This is the length we're talking about here, and it needs to be quarter wavelength, not half wave, not full wave, quarter wavelength. But what frequency? So anytime we talk about wavelength, it has to be related to a frequency, because to say something has a wavelength without specifying what the frequency is kind of meaningless. We need to know what that frequency is. And when we know what the frequency is, then we could figure out, well, what is the wavelength, or in this case here, the antenna length for that particular frequency. They have given it to us. They have said it's the 146 megahertz, which is the part of the 2-meter band. So you see how that trusty table that we provided a couple classes ago could be very important. I did mention you may want to print that out or have it handy, because you may want to be converting until you get comfortable on knowing that the 2-meter band is a certain frequency range, and the 6-meter band is a certain frequency range, and the 40-meter band is a certain frequency range. Have that table handy. So when you see 146 megahertz, what meter band is that again? You could take a look at the chart. What frequency is 2 meters again? Well, you could look at the chart. So we are talking about the 2-meter band. So that's what we're working with, an antenna for the 2-meter band. All right, but we are talking, was it a half-wave dipole they're asking us about? No, they're asking us about a quarter wavelength vertical. So quarter wave. So quarter wave, quarter of what? Well, they have given us, it's a 2-meter band. So we need to figure out what is quarter of 2. And the answer is 0.5. And we have the little working on the right-hand side here if you want to know how we got to 0.5. But it's essentially a quarter of 2, right? So the length or the wavelength of the 2-meter band, full wavelength, is 2 meters. But we are trying to construct a compact quarter wavelength antenna. So if the full wavelength is 2 meters and we want quarter wavelength, well, we take a quarter of 2, which is 0.5. So that's 0.5 what? Meters. And what did they ask us for in the question? They asked us what is the approximate length in inches. So you already know from the pattern from the last question, but yeah, we need to convert 0.5 meters to inches. And the conversion rate is 1 meter is equal to 39.4 inches, right? That's a given. That's the conversion factor. So we multiply 0.5 by 39.4 inches to get what the length is in inches. And that's our next step. We are saying that zero point 0.5 meters converted to inches is zero point 0.5 multiplied by 39.4, which is 19.7 inches. But is that the answer? Well, if you were to say, but wait a minute, last time we did this calculation, we now had to, because we are actually going to construct the antenna, we need to shorten it by 5%. We cannot leave it as the calculation that we have there. When we're actually building the antenna, we need to chop off 5%, and that will be our answer. So that's what we do. Again, 5% is 0.05, and we're trying to get now to take away 5%. So we're actually looking for 95% of it. So 95% is 0.95. So we multiply 0.95 by what we got earlier in our calculation in terms of number of inches, which is 19.7. And when we do that multiplication, we get approximately 19 inches, which is the correct answer for this question. They've asked us what is the approximate length in inches, and that's the answer, 19 inches. So folks, at this point, we want to take a 2-minute break. Let's take a stretch, get up, maybe have some water, probably a little bathroom break, and we'll be back in approximately 2 minutes time. Okay, so yes, good evening indeed, Adish. All right. Great to have you there. Jason, um, I just said it's too zoomed in. All right, I have it at 100% here, so I'm not sure why that would be. I'll have to look into it. Thanks for mentioning it. Okay, Noor, the question. Oh, okay. All right. So you said disregard. I guess we covered it as well. All right. Let's see if we could pick up where we left off, folks. We have a fair amount to cover tonight. So let's see if we could get going. So as we did the calculation, just bear in mind this 19 inches here for the quarter wavelength vertical antenna is this length here. So when we're constructing a quarter wavelength vertical antenna, this is what the 19 inches would be for the antenna. This is the element here, right? So cool. All right, so we have a couple concepts that we need to cover. One of them is called antenna loading. So it's a technique that amateurs use. You know, in life, you don't necessarily get something for nothing, right? So that's what we're trying to do here in amateur radio. We're trying to get something for nothing. We don't actually achieve it, but we could think we do. What if our antenna is too long? Let's say we put this antenna on top of our vehicle. We have a car and we put this antenna on top of the vehicle, but we find that every time that we go in a basement or we go below a car park area, that the antenna is knocking off or scraping, and I have to take the antenna down all the time. This is a magnetic base antenna. So my antenna is too long physically, and I want to shorten the antenna, but I still remember I need my antenna to be electrically, or at least equivalent for the frequency, it needs to be resonant for the frequency that I'm going to be transmitting and receiving on. So I can't just cut the antenna short, right? That will make it not resonant. I may have problems. I may end up with a hot radio when I'm transmitting my antenna, what we call SWR, which we'll deal with in the future classes, may be high, and my antenna, because it's too short, may result in a condition where the radio might be overheating. I might even damage that radio, right? So I can't just cut the antenna short because the antenna is too long. What I can do is load the antenna by coiling up a bit of it. So the length of it will actually be a little bit shorter, but electrically, for the purpose of the radio wave, it will still be the length of the entire antenna. So we are kind of shortening it vertically. That's what we're doing by coiling up a piece of it. And that coiling up there is called antenna loading. It is still going to be resonant on the frequency that the antenna is cut for, but it will be physically shorter. So I could put it on top of my roof and probably drive into the basement without knocking the antenna off. Maybe just that couple inches that I get by loading it might help me do that, right? So there's an exam question related to it. We have a bit more information on what loading is at the top here, but the exam question is what is in yellow here, which says, and it takes a different perspective, it says electrically lengthening by inserting inductors in radiating elements describes a type of antenna loading. So let's dissect what they mean here. So we said that if we want to physically shorten the antenna, we can coil it up like that, right? But what they're saying to us here is if we insert a coil into an antenna, and that's what this is here. It's a coil. And if you remember from previous classes, we say that a coil is also known as an inductor. It has inductance, right? What was the other type of component we talked about around the time we were talking inductors? You may remember as capacitors or capacitance. So we're talking about a coil. When we put it into the antenna here, what we actually do is electrically lengthen it, right? So we talked about it from the perspective of wanting to shorten the antenna. But if you have an antenna already at a certain length and you add a coil into it, what you're doing is lengthening it. If the antenna is already there and you coil a piece of it, you will physically shorten the antenna, but it will stay the same electrical length. But if you have an antenna that is already there and you add a coil, which is what they're saying here, you add a coil to it, you are going to increase the length electrically. And when we put a coil onto an antenna, it's called antenna loading. So that's what we have just dissected here. Electrically lengthening by inserting inductors in radiating elements, and radiating elements refer to the antenna element itself. Why they call it radiating elements? Now notice they're using all sorts of language and different terms to maybe try and tie us up, but this is the lingo of radio. This is the lingo of amateur radio. So radiating elements will be this element here because it's an element, the antenna element. And why is it a radiating element? Because when we transmit, it's from this element that the radio waves, the wireless waves are going to leave from. We can't see it, but it radiates. So they're calling it radiating elements here. So don't let those terms tie you up. All right. Let's come to another antenna type, which we might have seen before. It's called the beam antenna. There's another term that we'll be using shortly when we talk about beam antennas, and that is the Yagi-Uda antenna, or just simply the Yagi antenna. But for now, we'll call it a beam antenna. And we need to know that a beam antenna is a directional antenna, highly directional, because how it's constructed, we throw the majority of the signal in one direction, and that's what this blue arrow is attempting to represent here, that when we have this beam antenna, our signal is going maximally in this direction, very little to the back and very little to the side. I mean, it has its own lobe arrangement, but you need to know that it focuses a beam of the signal in this direction, and that's why we call it a beam antenna. And for the exam, there's a question, and it goes as follows. A beam antenna is an antenna that concentrates signals in one direction, which is pretty much what we just said a beam antenna was, right? It concentrates the signal, the transmission in one direction. Right. Let's come to another antenna, which is not really an antenna at all in a sense, right? It's more a theoretical concept. On your diagram, you'll see a little dot or spot, right? So we are talking now a bit about a conceptual antenna called the isotropic antenna, or sometimes called the isotropic radiator. So that is a sort of ideal antenna, right? And that's why we say it's not a practical antenna. It's an ideal theoretical antenna, which is a spot. And what that is used for, we're not going to construct an isotropic antenna. We're not going to buy an isotropic antenna per se, right? What we are doing is using this isotropic antenna concept as the reference antenna. So in a way, we could say that isotropic antenna doesn't exist, but we use it as the baseline to describe all other antennas, right? But we need to know about it. It's called the isotropic antenna, right? Because you'll hear us talking about the gain of an antenna with respect to an isotropic. So we would have covered dB in a previous class, decibel. And then you'll hear us talking about dBi, which means decibel with reference to the isotropic. So we need to know what I is. I is isotropic. So when we come to those things, we should remember that we talked a bit about the isotropic antenna or the isotropic theoretical antenna. It doesn't actually exist. But what we need to know about that ideal antenna that doesn't exist is that if we were to send a signal to this antenna, it will radiate the signal equally in every single direction. In other words, a sphere. That's what this grid outside here is. The signal is leaving this spot or this point and radiating equally all around. You know, in a way, sometimes you have a light bulb and you see it light up the entire place. Kind of like that, you know, if you want to think about it. It illuminates all over. Well, not exactly. Sometimes a light bulb will have a little shadow where it's mounted. But you get the idea that that isotropic antenna or radiator is an ideal imaginary antenna that doesn't exist, but it will radiate the signal in all directions. And that's why we use it as a reference antenna to describe other antennas. Right. So let's come to how we use the isotropic antenna. So on the right-hand side of your diagram here, we are showing the isotropic antenna that exists somewhere in the center here, and the radiation pattern of this antenna is all around equal. So if we transmit using this theoretical antenna, we will send our signal in all directions equally. And we will say that this being the reference antenna, it has zero gain. And notice what we talked about, dBi. So some of this will start to come in here, and we need to appreciate what it means when we see it. When we see it, we say, oh yeah, I know that. That looks quite familiar. We know what dB is, and we just said that this little I means the isotropic antenna. So we have a gain of zero. So no gain when we're talking about the isotropic antenna. So everything else is reference to this isotropic. So if you do more or better than the isotropic antenna, then you have a positive gain, right? So this is what we're trying to illustrate here. So the isotropic antenna has 0 dB gain or 0 dBi. And again, dBi is decibel with respect to the isotropic antenna. So dBi, right? But if I had maybe a beam antenna like we saw a little earlier, and I show the radiation pattern of that, remember we said that the beam antenna is going to try and throw the signal in one direction. It's very directional. Like a flashlight is going to point the signal in one direction mostly, and very little goes in the other directions. Well, this is our beam antenna. And if we look at our radiation pattern and compare it to the isotropic radiation pattern, that's why it's a comparison, we'll notice it's not a nice and circular like the signal lobe coming from a directional antenna like a beam. So this is how we can say now that I'm sending the same signal. I'm sending the same signal that I would have sent to the isotropic to the beam, but the beam concentrates it in this direction and therefore pushes it forward this way. And this is where the concept of gain comes in. It's the same signal I'm sending, but because of the properties of the antenna, it focuses that just like a flashlight in one direction. And we have now gain associated with the antenna. But when we describe the gain of this antenna, we describe it with respect to the gain of the isotropic, which is 0. So once we have positive gain, it will be a positive dBi. So again, we say gain in dBi. And each antenna, you will hear about it has, well, a 3 dB gain, or 4 dB gain, or 6 dB gain, or 9 dB gain, or 12 dB gain. You'll hear all of that. But the question you need to ask, okay, it's 3 dB gain with reference to what? Is it with respect to the isotropic? Yes, because it could also be with respect to what is called the dipole. We dealt with that earlier. Someone can give you a gain in respect of the dipole, right? So we need to know, is it dBi in the case of isotropic, or is it dBd in the case of dipole? But for now, the isotropic is used as the reference, and then our gain is in reference to the isotropic. So let's come now to the exam question. Hopefully will address what we just discussed. It says that antenna gain is the increase in signal strength in a specified direction compared to a reference antenna. And we just put in here isotropic, because when they talk about reference antenna, well, usually it's the isotropic, but I just mentioned to you it could also be in respect to a dipole. We can give gain reference to a dipole. So there's a reference antenna. Oftentimes as amateur radio operators, you will hear about the isotropic. So don't get too tied up when we see dBi. It's decibels with respect to the isotropic, how far it goes beyond what the isotropic would, or dBd, which is with respect to the dipole. All right, so let's put up a couple more antennas here on our screen so that we can see what some of these antennas look like. So we already dealt with the quarter wave vertical, but just bear in mind that we could have a half wave vertical, and we could also have a 5/8 wave vertical, and so on. And what's the difference between the antennas? Well, really the length of this element here. So this from top to bottom of the antenna will be quarter wavelength for whatever the frequency is. Whether it's 2 meters or 6 meters or whatever the frequency is, it needs to be quarter wavelength of that frequency. If it's a half wave antenna, well, the construction is very similar, but this length needs to be half wave. If it's a 5/8 wave, and yes, people, 5/8 wave is a thing, it will be 5/8 of the wavelength. So this is just to give you a little idea. On the right-hand side, we're just kind of showing what the radiation pattern is when you look at it top down, right? When you look at it from top, the signal radiates all around, right? So this is just some reference information. Let's go with a little more reference information. So again, on the left-hand side here, we have what a dipole looks like, a half-wave dipole, right? Element going up, element going down. right? And remember, each leg here is quarter wavelength for the entire thing to be half wavelength, right? And on the right-hand side, what does this antenna look like? And if you're saying, but wait, it looks like the letter J or J-shaped, well, it does, and that is actually the name of the antenna. It's a J-pole antenna. So we'll be talking about these antennas, and we just wanted to make it real so that you can see what these antennas look like. So with the J-pole, you have the feed line coming up here, connecting to the antenna. And this is our antenna here, made out of nice shiny copper, right? J-pole, right? So we'll talk about these antennas. So when we talk about them, you're like, okay, I've seen what it looks like if you haven't seen it before. So let's talk about a couple more antennas. So we talked about our beam. And remember I mentioned to you that we may be calling the beam the Yagi, Y-A-G-I, right? So it just pointed in a different direction to what we saw it pointed in, but this antenna could point in any direction. You could move it, you could fix mount it to point in one direction, or you could put it on a rotor or rotator and have it move at your will. So you could point the antenna, and that's a thing, right? Hams do that. So that's the Yagi. At the bottom here, again, it's facing the wrong direction, but this is a little bit of the radiation pattern of these types of antennas, right? We just kind of stuck that in as extra information. But again, it's kind of the wrong way around because you recognize that this antenna is actually facing this direction, but the lobe of this pattern is in this direction. So please don't worry too much about that. This is just a bit of extra information here. And then we have an antenna called the quad. Again, we're not going to come to this in a little while. And then there's an antenna called a dish. And this is just to give you an idea of the different antenna types that exist out there. So extra information for you. All right, so let's get to what we need to learn and understand in respect of our exams. All right, so remember we talked about the different types of antennas. Again, we represent them here on your screen. We have the isotropic, which is not a real antenna. We have the J-pole, and we have a 5/8 wave Yagi antenna, all of these things. Because one of the questions they're going to ask you, of all of these types of antennas, which one has the highest amount of gain? That's a question. So we have tried to put up all the information here, all of the research. Apart from you just learning what the correct answer is, we have tried to provide all of the information, what it looks like, what the specifications are, and how it might look visually, so we could understand why this is the correct answer that we're going to give, right? So let's look at the question and let us see what the correct answer is. And let us see how we are able to actually figure out what the correct answer was. So they're asking us of the following types of antennas, right? The isotropic, which we talked about. We just were introduced to the J-pole. We were introduced to the 5/8 wave vertical and the Yagi, which is a beam antenna. Of these four types of antennas, right, which one has the greatest amount of gain, right? So let's first of all look at it from a radiation pattern perspective. So if this is our isotropic antenna, we saw that, well, it's an ideal antenna and therefore it radiates all around in equal directions, equal signal strength. So, no gain. The J-pole actually has some gain. It radiates in this way. It radiates in all of these directions here, right? So there's a little bit of gain with respect to the isotropic. So there's some gain. The 5/8 wave has even more gain. So notice how it goes a little further out this way. Notice that compared to the isotropic and even the J-pole. And then the Yagi, if you notice about the Yagi is also sending a lot of its signal strength in one direction and actually very little or much less in this direction, right? Now, these are not perfect diagrams. This is just to illustrate the concept, folks. So this is not the actual radiation pattern. This is just to relatively show that a Yagi throws and concentrates that signal in this direction very well. So that is actually the answer. Just by looking at this here, when we look at the radiation pattern, all things else being equal, the Yagi will send that signal further and concentrate it even further. So therefore, is the antenna that has the greatest gain. Again, look at them here. The isotropic radiator, ideal, no gain. We have the J-pole, which has a bit of gain. The 5/8 wave that has even more gain. But the Yagi, because it's concentrating like a flashlight, all of the signal in one direction, it has the most amount of gain. And let's look at the actual gain figures. The isotropic, we said that's 0 dB gain. No gain at all, right? That's the reference antenna that we're using. The J-pole can give a gain of somewhere between 2 and 3 decibel with respect to the isotropic. It can, the 5/8 wave vertical antenna gives about 3 dB with respect to the isotropic, right? So not much more than the J-pole, but a bit more, or about maximally, yeah. And then the Yagi, we're saying it can do from 6 to 20 dB. Now, you might be saying, but wait a minute, that's a wide variation. Well, it really depends on many things. And one of the things is we are showing here 3-element Yagi. You have the driven, you have the reflector, and you have the director. And you have the mast here. So it's a 3-element, right? This is just the mast it's mounted on. 3 elements, but if we were to put 4 elements and 5 elements and 6 elements and so on as directors, you will find that the gain goes up. So that's why we say a Yagi can have a gain of somewhere between 6 and 20. So hopefully we would have understood for this question in the question pool why the Yagi is the correct answer for it. Look at that. Look at the beautiful amount of gain that you're getting here, right? And look at it in numbers as well. So of all of these 4 antennas, isotropic, J-pole, 5/8 wave vertical, and Yagi is the one that has the greatest amount of gain. All right, let's talk about another antenna. It's an antenna that is used very, very, very regularly, right? It's an antenna you might have seen quite a bit. Sometimes maybe even the earlier mobile phones might have had antennas that look like it, right? Handheld radios today typically will have an antenna on it that looks like this. So we have an expanded view of what the antenna might be. And we call this quite affectionately a rubber duck antenna, or you may hear it be called rubber ducky, right? So rubber duck antenna, right? And rubber ducky is not the same as the cybersecurity tool, by the way, folks, right? So rubber duck antenna is connected to a handheld radio. The thing about this antenna, it's not a very good antenna, right? Because of the length and because it uses what we call a loading coil, most of the antenna is actually going to be a coil, very likely. So it's not a very efficient antenna, and we'll see in another slide that there are disadvantages. But we need to know what a rubber duck antenna looks like, right? This is what it looks like on a radio. Okay, so we need to learn something for the exam with respect to the rubber duck antenna. So again, the reason why we use rubber duck antennas is because we need a compact antenna. So if you see a person, REACT members, amateur radio operators, security firms, persons in industry that need to do two-way radio communication, you'll see a walkie-talkie or a handheld radio that's attached to their waist or that's in their hand. It may look something like this. You will see this antenna and you'll see it looks, you say, but wait a minute, I thought antennas are supposed to be metal. Yeah, but this is encased in rubber or plastic of some sort for safety and flexibility and all of that, right? So this is a rubber duck antenna, but it's not a very good antenna. It works, it's compact, but it's not very efficient at all. So don't think for a moment that a rubber duck antenna is any great antenna. Sorry to disappoint you, but it's very portable, it's very compact, and it works. All right, so we need to know this point here, this bullet point for the exam. A disadvantage of the short, flexible antenna supplied with most handheld radio transceivers compared to a full-size quarter wave antenna is that it has low efficiency. Let's say that again. A disadvantage of the short, flexible antenna supplied with most handheld radio transceivers compared to a full-size quarter wave antenna is that it has a low efficiency. So what are they talking about, the flexible antenna supplied with most handheld radio transceivers? This is a handheld radio transceiver, and the antenna that is supplied is called a rubber duck. So we're talking about the rubber duck or the rubber ducky antenna. And we're comparing it to a full-size quarter wave. This is not quarter wavelength at all. At least physically, it might be quarter wavelength because it uses a loading coil. Electrically, it might be quarter wavelength, but physically, it's not a quarter wavelength antenna in this sense. It could be some other wavelength, but it's a shorter antenna. It's not going to be very efficient. All of these issues that we showed here, it's going to be poor signal, poor quality, less directionality, and so on. makes it not a great antenna, but it works and it's a compromise. We just need to know that it's a disadvantage of using that compared to if we could have put a full size type of antenna, like a quarter wave, onto this radio. If we put a quarter wave onto this, it'll be a very long antenna and we may not be able to do that. It's not going to be very practical. So this is the exam question. Let's move on and talk now about the shielding effect. What is the shielding effect? So if I were to be inside of a car and I'm operating on 2 meters and I have my handheld radio inside of the car, that car, the metal body of the car, assuming this car is all metallic all around, except for probably the areas where you have small openings such as the window, this car is going to shield that signal and keep a lot of that signal from going out, right? The shielding effect. So our radio operators might be thinking, oh, that's why I probably don't get to the repeater when I'm inside the car. And when I stop and I step out, I get good access. They tell me I'm loud and clear, but inside they tell me I'm picket fencing or I'm sounding very weak or low audio because my signal is not getting out of the car. But if I were to use an external antenna, look at this. The signal will go into the air. It's not being blocked or it's not being restricted. It's not being shielded. So we need to know that if we were to have an antenna, radio inside of the car with the antenna inside of the car, the shielding effect operates. All right. So we need to know for the exam that a disadvantage of using a handheld VHF transceiver with a flexible antenna inside a vehicle is that the signal strength is reduced due to the shielding effect of the vehicle. And that's what we just talked about. So we have our radio. It's a handheld radio. It's a VHF radio. And it is inside of a vehicle. And therefore, the wavelength of that VHF may be 2 meters. So it's much longer than the biggest opening in the vehicle, right? So that wave is going to be kind of trapped or shielded inside of vehicles. That's why they tell us it's a VHF transceiver, right? It's going to be shielded. And therefore, the signal strength is going to be reduced because of that shielding effect inside of the vehicle. So we should really ideally not use on a radio or one of those handhelds inside of the vehicle, right? If it works because you're doing short range transmissions, okay, fair enough. But if someone is telling you they're not hearing you, you're not getting the signal out, well, step outside of the vehicle if you can. Step out safely and use it because the shielding effect is what is keeping you back. All right, something else for the exam we need to know. So we go into some radiation patterns here. And on your screen, you have a diagram that shows 2 radiation patterns. One of a quarter wave antenna. So if we were to look at this lobe here, that stops here, right? This almost circular lobe here. That is the radiation pattern of our quarter wave antenna. So this is an antenna here. We are transmitting, the signal goes out, and goes as far as here, right? It doesn't go any further. Right? Of course, in all the directions like that, it goes up to here. It doesn't go any further. But for 5/8 wave antenna, the radiation pattern is a little bit different. We have a kind of funny looking lobe here, and then it goes and goes, and it goes all the way here. So notice the difference between the quarter wave lobe and the 5/8 wave lobe. So these 2 antennas have a different radiation pattern. Notice that the 5/8 wave actually goes further. So in other words, the gain of the 5/8 wave antenna, because of that radiation pattern, is stronger or more than the gain on the quarter wavelength antenna. All right. So we just kind of showed mobile antennas here. This is a 5/8 wave and this is a quarter wave antenna, maybe in the UHF or the VHF band, right? So the quarter wave is shorter than the 5/8 wave, right? So it's not to scale, but just to show it is shorter. So you have the radiation pattern for the quarter wave and you have the radiation pattern for the 5/8 wave. And the takeaway from that is that the 5/8 wave goes further. So let's see the question that is related to this. An advantage of a 5/8 wavelength whip antenna for VHF or UHF mobile service is that it has more gain than a quarter wavelength antenna. And that is what this diagram shows, the radiation pattern of a quarter wave antenna versus a 5/8 wave antenna. That's all this diagram is intended to show us. 5/8 wave gets you further than a quarter wave. All right, so let's continue. All right, so we still have a few slides to go, folks, so we'll be impinging on your time a little bit. We're trying to cover the material, but let's see how quickly we can do it. So we need to be aware what feedline is, and we would have mentioned feedlines previously, right? And we said that the feedline is this cable that we use to connect our radio to our antenna, or our transceiver to the radiating element called the antenna, right? That's the feedline, or sometimes called a transmission line. It allows the radio frequency that's generated by a radio as a conduit to the antenna, because we don't want that radio frequency to leave the radio at the radio. We don't want it to leave the feed line at the feed line. We want it to go all the way to the antenna and then radiate from the antenna. That's the purpose of the feed line. It's like a pipe that we're trying to get all of that signal through until it reaches here, and then now it can spill out and go wirelessly into all directions. So one of the important things about the feed line is, remember we said before that hams are matchmakers. So one of the things we need to match as amateur radio operators is something called impedance. And we'll be talking more and more about impedance as we go on in the course. But for now, suffice it to say that we need to match the impedance of the transmitter to the feed line to the antenna. And 50 ohms, by the way, is the actual impedance that we use in amateur radio to match. So you'll be seeing or hearing more about 50 ohms. But impedance is important in amateur radio. We need to match. Why? Because hams are match makers. When you match the impedance, you get maximum signal transfer. From the time that impedance is mismatched, you will have reflections, you will have not all of your signal gets into the antenna. You'll get your radio overheating, so there are problems associated with it. All right, so let's talk about those feed line or cables, coaxial cable. This is what coaxial cable is constructed like. You have the outer jacket, you have a sort of copper braid, you have the insulation inside, sometimes called the dielectric, and then you have the main copper wire inside of there. So that's coaxial cable. This is what it might also look like wrapped up. It might also look like this when you have the connectors on. And we have two types that we'll be talking about for this type of coaxial, RG58 and RG213. And there's another type of cable that's called hard lined. Some people might know it as the trade name Heliax. So this is another type of feed line. This is what it looks like. More on this in a bit. So for the exam, we need to know a couple of things about what you just discussed. And that is that coaxial cable, that's cable like this, is the most common feed line for amateur radio antenna systems because it is easy to use and it requires very few special installation considerations. So it's very easy to make up, very easy to handle, and that's why it's very popular. So you need to know that for the exam, coax cable or coaxial cable. For now, we just need to know that impedance, we talked about it. We need to match impedance between the transmitter and the antenna and the feed line. Just need to know for now that impedance is the opposition to alternating current flow or AC current flow. And you might be thinking, but wait a minute, I've heard of something that is in opposition to current flow before. And if you may remember resistance, when we were talking about DC circuits, you'll be quite correct. So impedance is what we refer to when we talk about opposing the flow of current in AC circuits. Just like when we talked about it previously, we talked about resistance. We said the unit of resistance was the ohm. Well, guess what? The unit of impedance, because it is holding back, because it is, stopping. Remember that diagram that we had with volt and we had the impedance. Well, we had the resistance and we had the current. The unit of impedance is also the ohm, and that's an exam question. Last exam question. The most common impedance of coaxial cable used in amateur radio is what? We talked about it just now. We said it's 50 ohms. It's not 75 ohms. It's not something else. It's 50 ohms, 50. So you need to learn that for the exam. And as amateur radio operators, you'll find yourself using 50 ohm coaxial cable or 50 ohm cable quite a lot. All right, let's continue. So again, we have a diagram here that shows two of the different types of coaxial cables, RG58 and RG213. Those are the two types of cables. But what we need to learn for the exam is a couple of properties of coax cables. So first of all, if we were to look at RG58 cable and we were to use that 100 foot of that on VHF, and the frequency we're going to use is 146 megahertz. Well, because cable has losses, we will experience a loss of 5.1 dB, and the output that reaches the antenna, let's say we are putting in 100 watts, will be 31.3 watts. So that's quite a bit of loss for RG58 at 100 feet, right? But if I were to change frequency, so the same setup, but instead of using a VHF frequency, I were to use a UHF frequency. So instead of 146 megahertz, I'm tuning my radio now to 444 megahertz, say, for example, right? One is VHF, one is UHF, but I'm using the same coaxial cable RG58 that had a loss of 5.1 dB when I was dealing with 146 megahertz. But look at what happens when I change frequency to 444 megahertz. The loss is not 5.1, it goes up to 9.8 dB loss, and that's 9.8 dB per 100 foot. So here's the thing. We are now going to end up with much less power out. We are sending 100 watts in on the coax cable, but we're only getting 10.5 watts out. Why is that so? Because the loss is higher the higher the frequency you apply. So while we had only a 5.1 dB loss at VHF frequency, we have 9.8 dB loss at the UHF frequency. And that is what we need to learn, that as we increase the frequency, the loss is also increased for the same cable. Let's deal with another type of cable, RG213, which is a better cable, meaning it has less loss per foot. The loss per 100 foot of RG213 cable is 2.3 dB. Notice it's less loss than the RG58 cable, but it's still some loss, right? But notice that when I use it on the VHF frequency, 146 megahertz, it's only 2.3 dB loss per 100 foot. But when I go to a higher frequency, 444 megahertz, notice how much higher. It's kind of like almost double. It's 4.4 dB loss per 100 foot. So even though RG213 cable is better coaxial cable, it is less loss cable. Once I change the frequency and I go higher, I increase my frequency, my loss increases. So if I were to go to even higher frequency, the loss will be even more, and so on. And I have a little table that will hopefully illustrate that a little bit further. But here's another thing we need to know for the exam. Apart from when we increase frequency for the particular cable, there's increased loss. We need to know between these two types of cables, RG58 and RG213, we need to know that the RG213 is a better quality cable in the sense that there's less loss. And if we go to the RG58 and you use this cable instead, we'll have a higher loss. So going from one to the other, we increase the loss, right? And those are two exam questions that we have. As the frequency of a signal in coaxial cable is increased, the loss increases. That's the first point that we showed here. So the same cable, if we use this frequency, we experience this amount of loss per foot, per 100 foot. And if we use this higher frequency, the loss per 100 foot has increased just because we use an increased frequency. We punch in a higher frequency on our radio. Also for the exam, we need to know that the electrical difference between RG58 and RG213, those are two types of coaxial cables, is that RG213 has less loss at a given frequency. And hopefully you can see that here. RG213 for a particular frequency, let's say VHF compared to RG58, it's 2.3 dB loss, which is lower than 5.1 dB loss for the RG58. This is the loss for the RG58, and this is our loss for the RG213. And RG213 is less loss for the given frequency. And it is also true for this other frequency as well. So these are two exam questions. So this table here, you do not need to learn, you do not need to know it for the exam. However, this is just given to you as a reference for the frequency bands that amateurs use, some of them, and some different types of cables Again, you don't need to learn this for the exam, but hopefully you can see that the better the quality cable, it's less loss. So as we go to the right, we're increasing the quality of the cable, right? So better quality cable, less loss. All right. So we also need to know that, remember we talked about hardline cable. We also mentioned that it can go by the trade name Heliax. That's this type of cable here, right? Solid copper corrugated outer and also similar on the inside and sort of air insulated on the inside, right? You just have something separating the two to keep it apart, but air insulated. This type of cable is actually the type of cable that has the lowest loss. It's also very expensive. The connectors are very expensive to put on as well, difficult, but it is better in quality than coaxial, and therefore it has less loss. It's much more rigid, much more difficult to handle, but that's an exam question. That air insulated hardline, that type of feed line, has the lowest loss at VHF and UHF frequencies, so it's the best quality cable. So you need to learn that for the exam. Also for the exam, we need to know about, apart from the different types of cable, there are other sources that could reduce the signal strength, right? So what are the other sources of loss in cable, coaxial cable, well, or even hardline, any type of cable? If water gets in to the cable or the connectors, that's a problem. That's going to result in loss. We haven't spoken about SWR or standing wave ratio as yet. We'll come to that at the end of today. We'll just quickly touch on it, but next week we'll be getting into SWR in detail. But something what we call a high SWR. And SWR, remember we say that hams are matchmakers? Well, when you have a high SWR, you are not very well matched. A low SWR means that you are very well matched. So if you have a high SWR, that will also result in loss. You need to learn this for the exam. We'll discuss what SWR is over the next session. Another reason that there's loss or can be loss in feed line, coaxial feed line, is, well, if we were to look at the bottom here, this is a sort of coax cable, right? And you'll see that on the end of this cable, there's a connector, and then we use a sort of adapter here and to join, and there's another connector, and then there's the cable here. Anytime we introduce connectors into a cable, maybe we want to use a patch, maybe we want to join it, maybe we want to extend the cable, but instead of using a full length of cable with end connectors, we say, you know what, we already have a length, let's add on a length. And to add on a length, we have to put on a connector and then use this sort of other connector to join what you call a coupler. All of these connectors have losses in them. And therefore, if you use multiple connectors in the line, you can also have loss in that cable. And that's the point here in this question. They'll ask you, what of the following, which one could be sources of loss in coaxial feed line? All of them are actually correct, because all of these can contribute to loss in coax feed line. We also need to know for the exam that moisture, water, wetting is not good for cables. It causes contamination and failure of the cables, and that's an exam question. Moisture contamination causes failure of coax cables. So water in your feed line is not good. All right. So a couple of other things we need to learn for the exam. So we did say that hardline is the lowest lost type of cable of all that we have discussed compared to coaxial cable, right? So there we are. We also need to know that UV light or ultraviolet light is not good for coax cables, or any kind of cable for that matter, because it can cause deterioration, especially in the outer jacket. This material on the outside here could deteriorate, it could get dry rot, it could break up, crack up, and allow water to go inside, which we said is not good for coax cables. You do not want water inside of there. It needs to be nice and tight and sealed. But if you do not use cable that is resistant to UV light or ultraviolet light from the sun, those sun rays, then all of this outer insulation will dry rot, crack up, and allow water, when rain falls or condensation occurs, for water to get inside of there. So that's the first bullet point, that the outer jacket of coaxial cable should be resistant to ultraviolet or UV light, because ultraviolet light can damage the jacket and allow water to enter the cable, which is what we just said. So this is an exam question. UV rated cables are what you need. Why? To keep water out, because if they crack up under UV, water will get in. Not good. All right. So we also need to learn this bullet point here. So I'll just read it out. It says a disadvantage of air core coaxial cable, and we're talking really about hardline, when compared to foam or solid dielectric types, is that it requires special techniques to prevent moisture in the cable. So what we are saying is here, to seal this cable up and to keep it moisture free, you may need to have special techniques. Some of them, believe it or not, they put a pump to vacuum inside of there, or you have desiccant to keep it dry and all of that. So they go through at great lengths. But for your exam, you just need to know that you may need to apply special techniques to these, what they call air core coaxial cable, or simply air insulated hardline. They are require much more care to prevent moisture from going inside of there. So that's a disadvantage of this type of cable. All right, so we have two types of connectors. We have been talking about the coaxial cable, and we need to terminate those cables. These are two examples of connectors. We'll talk a bit more about it shortly, but we've just given you a nice blown up view. You have the PL259 and you have the N-type. All right, so for the exam, we need to know that the PL259 connector works pretty well on HF frequencies and VHF frequencies. So you see where this knowing what is HF, what is VHF, and even what is UHF comes in. So that trusty diagram, folks, suggest that you keep it handy, print it out, have it with you. So PL259s are good for HF and VHF, which is an exam question. PL259 type coax connectors are commonly used at HF and VHF frequencies. So these are the connectors that you put at the end of the coaxial cable. And also, we said this is the N-type connector. Notice how it looks quite a bit different, the N-type. And we need to know that the N-type connector or type N connector is the RF, and RF here simply means radio frequency connector type that is most suitable for frequencies above 400 megahertz. Again, sorry for the Z being capitalized, folks, that's a typo. But 400 megahertz is in the UHF part of the spectrum. Remember, UHF is 300 megahertz to 3000 megahertz, right? So that's why knowing where UHF and VHF is. So it says frequencies above 400, so you know that is UHF. So for UHF, this is a better connector compared to this connector. And that's what you need to know for the exam. N-type or type N is suitable for 400 megahertz and above, or UHF. So this is the last point that we'll make here. We will talk next week more about what SWR or standing wave ratio is. But we're going to deal with this in the question pool now shortly. So we just stuck it inside of here as a point. We'll describe what SWR is subsequently from the next session, session 10. And that bullet point, which is an exam question, is that loose connection in the antenna or feed line can cause erratic changes in SWR, and SWR is standing wave ratio. What they're trying to tell us here is that these are connectors that goes onto the end of the cable, and you will see that here. Right, this is your cable. Well, let's get a better, right? So you see how the connectors here go onto the cable. This terminates the cable, and this now screws into your radio, which screws into the antenna and makes the connection. What they're saying that this can become loose. And while it may be matched otherwise, if it's loose, it can cause mismatch. Remember, we say hams are matchmakers, and that's what SWR is about. So if these connectors are loose, they're not properly soldered, right? You use poor soldering techniques, or they become, somehow disconnected. Maybe it's broken or something like that. If it's a loose connection, or you do not screw this on tightly onto the radio or tightly onto the antenna, or maybe vibration causes it to loosen out. Maybe you didn't use something to seal it and make sure it's rigid after you put it on. That can cause the SWR, which is a match between your radio, the transmission line, and the antenna, to go off. Right? So you just need to know that if this is loose, that's not good. And you can have changes in your SWR, which is a problem. And we'll talk more a bit about that in our next session. So folks, we have come to the end of the theory, and we just need to quickly go through our question pool. And we have an announcement at the end. and we will call that a night. So let's go quickly to our question pool, and for persons who are following in the book, we are going to do pages 46 to 53 in the question pool. All right, folks. So let's go and speed through these questions because we just dealt with all of the theory, right? So again, for you to see what the question actually looks like in the exam. Which of the following describes a simple dipole oriented parallel to Earth's surface? So we knew that as a horizontally polarized antenna. So you see how the theory is coming together? All right, next question in the question pool. In which direction does a half-wave dipole antenna radiate the strongest signal? So we put that up on a couple of slides. We showed that it's broadside to the antenna where you have the maximum amount of signal radiating from a dipole. What is the approximate length in inches of a half-wavelength 6-meter dipole antenna? We did this as a worked example. It's half wavelength and 6 meters. So correct answer is 112. Remember, we had to convert from meters to inches and then take out 5%. So there's the answer. Also, next question in question pool, which of the following increases the resonant frequency of a dipole antenna? So we say if we shorten the antenna, the frequency goes up, right? So shortening is the answer. What is the approximate length in inches of a quarter wavelength vertical antenna for 146 megahertz? We also did this as a worked example, and the answer was 19 inches. Right? Remember, we took a quarter of 2 meters because we know 146 megahertz is in the 2 meter band, so a quarter of 2 meters, and we got it in inches, and then we converted it using the 5% takeoff. Right? Next question in question pool. Which of the following describes a type of antenna loading? And the answer is electrically lengthening by inserting inductors and radiating elements. That is a type of antenna loading. What is a beam antenna? Well, it's an antenna that concentrates signals in one direction. What's a good example of a beam antenna? Well, a Yagi, yeah? Okay. What is antenna gain? Antenna gain is the increase in signal strength in a specified direction compared to a reference antenna. We said the reference antenna could be the isotropic radiator, and it could even be a dipole. All right, next question in the question pool. Which of the following types of antenna offers the greatest gain? So we have these 4 types here, and we showed diagrammatically, we showed statistically, we showed the specifications of these, all things being equal, these 4 types of antennas, and we saw that the Yagi had the greatest throw. So it's the Yagi has the greatest gain. All right. What is a disadvantage of the short flexible antenna supplied with most handheld radio transceivers compared to a full-sized quarter wave antenna? So what are they asking us about? If we dissect this question, short flexible antennas supplied with most handheld radio transceivers, we're talking about the rubber ducky. What do you remember about the rubber ducky? Well, it has low efficiency. Next question in the question pool. What is a disadvantage of using handheld VHF transceiver with a flexible antenna inside of a vehicle? So we said that if we were to do that, our signal strength would be reduced due to the shielding effect of the vehicle. All of that metal all around on top of us inside and so on. Right? It shields the signal. Next question in the question pool. What is an advantage of a 5/8 wavelength whip antenna for VHF or UHF mobile service? Well, there are several answers that I gave you here, but we had learned that it works better than a quarter wavelength antenna. So it has more gain than a quarter wavelength antenna. That's the correct answer. Next question in the question pool. Why is coaxial cable the most common feed line for amateur radio antenna systems? Well, really kind of convenient. It is easy to use and requires few special considerations. Easy peasy. Next question in the question pool. What is impedance? So we learned today that impedance is the opposition to AC or alternating current flow. All right. Next question in the question pool. What is the unit of impedance? Well, we said it's just like resistance, and resistance was the ohm. So we also use the ohm as the unit of impedance. What is the most common impedance of coaxial cables used in amateur radio? It's not 8 ohms, it's not 600, it's not 12 ohms. We didn't do it any of these. It's 50 ohms, just about half. 50 ohms, 50. Correct answer. Next question in the question pool. What happens at the frequency, I say again, what happens as the frequency of a signal in coaxial cable is increased? So we just did that in the table there. We saw that if we increase the frequency, the loss is increased. All right. What is the electrical difference between RG58 and RG213 coaxial type cables? Well, we said that the RG213 is a better quality cable, so therefore it has less loss at the given frequency. RG213 is better than RG58. Which of the following types of feed line has the lowest loss at VHF and UHF? Well, it's not the regular coax, it is the hard line, the air insulated hard line. Also what we sometimes in amateur radio refer to as the trade name Heliax. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following is a source of loss in coaxial feed line? So we just did a slide with 3 bullet points. So all of them were correct. Water intrusion into coaxial connectors. If water got into those, it will increase the loss, which is not good. If we have a high SWR, which we are yet to learn more about in the subsequent class, what SWR is, but if it's high, that will also be a loss in the coax, cause a loss. And also, if you join cable using a lot of connectors in the line, well, each connector is a source of loss. So all of these are correct. Yeah. So which of the following causes failure of coax cables? Well, we said moisture is not a good friend of coax cables. So moisture contamination is the correct answer. Why should the outer jacket of coaxial cable be resistant to ultraviolet light? So remember we said that UV light from the sun is going to get onto that outer jacket of the coaxial cable. It might crack it, it might cause it to leak, water might end up inside of the cable if that would happen. Well, that's exactly what occurs. Ultraviolet light or UV light can damage the jacket and allow water to enter the cable. Water, not good inside of your coax cable. What is a disadvantage of air core coaxial cable when compared to foam or solid dielectric types? So we said that type of cable requires some attention and special techniques to prevent moisture from getting into the cable. All right, last couple of questions. Which of the following is true of PL259 type coax connectors? So we showed 2 types of coax connectors. Those are the connectors that goes at the ends to terminate your coaxial cable. And they want to know what's true of the PL259 type. Well, they are pretty good and commonly used for HF and VHF frequencies. So that's the answer. They are commonly used at HF and VHF. No problem. We don't want to use it for UHF, right? For UHF, that's the next question. What do we use? Which of the following RF connected types is most suitable for frequencies above 400 megahertz? So read that as UHF and above. So it's not the PL259. We don't know what RS213, DB25. Those are not RF connectors anyway. The N type or the type N connector is the correct answer for UHF frequencies, 400 megahertz and above. Remember, UHF is 300 megahertz to 3000 megahertz, or 3 gigahertz. All right, so last question in the question pool for this evening. We've kept you long enough. What can cause erratic changes in SWR? So we're yet to talk about what SWR is. It's about matching. It's very important for amateur radio operators, and we'll discuss it next week. But what can cause erratic changes? Well, we were just talking about coax cables, and we're talking about the connectors related to those cables that we put onto the end. Well, that is one of the things. If we have loose connection in the antenna, or in the coax cable or the feed line. That could cause our SWR or matching to be erratic and change, which is not good. So folks, we have come to the end of our session this evening, but before we close, let me just go back to our slide deck. All right, so first of all, everyone, thank you for the extra time this evening. We're really trying to get through all of the material. And as always, please do email and send WhatsApp messages. I do apologize. We have been a bit snowed in with a lot of, we have quite a large class, and we will take a little while to get around to all of the messages sent during the course of this week. All right, so I did mention we had an announcement. So at this point in the course, we are teaching a lot of theory. And the idea is we say it's light touch theory with exam focus. So we are trying to prepare all candidates, all students to successfully take and pass the exam. But like so many things, there are things that we don't necessarily cover as part of our theory and what we discuss in the syllabus and what the curriculum contains. And those are some of the practical aspects of amateur radio. Things that we might have skirted, things you might have been curious about. I think things that I've seen, and this is my answer to a couple of the questions that we got from students. I'm hoping that this can help. We have an online video. The link is on your screen. It's called Practical Radio Operating Tips. It was something we did about 2 years ago. And we'd encourage students to please consider taking a look at this video. It's about an hour and a half, just about the same length of each of our sessions. And we want to encourage you to take a look at it because we get a little more into some practical tips. Again, some of them that we may not cover at all in our theoretical construct. Remember, in our time that we have, we're trying to be laser focused on the exam, right? So please consider taking a look at this video and also feel free to provide some feedback if you have looked at it. It may help you to understand certain things about radio, especially for persons who may not have had any experience yet using two-way radio systems, right? All right, so our next session will be next week, Friday, 16th of June, usual start time around 8:30 p.m. So folks, again, thank you for the extra time. I want to wish you all the best. Have a great weekend, be safe, and have a good night.